what point did you start to think about Bitcoin and national security and sort of how it could really protect us in the future? I mean, right now, what I find so interesting about Bitcoin is it's literally under constant attack. It's under constant cyber attack, and it's growing more and more resilient every single year. And I think that's amazing.
You know, I think this is probably true for a lot of people. When we're reading how Bitcoin works, how the protocol works, we look at it kind of through our lens of expertise. So finance people look at it through a finance lens, whoever looks at it through a whoever lens. I'm a military guy. I look at it through a military lens. And so, you know, when I looked at it, I saw something completely different than like what I guess, you know, your typical Wall Street trader would think. I saw, and I know this sounds crazy, well, I guess let me plot out my journey. I'm part of the military, right? Why do we have a military? We have a military because for whatever reason, civilization has decided that the way you determine who owns what, for example, who owns what territory, is you engage in a power projection competition. And whoever wins that power projection competition gets to say, this is America versus this is King George colony. Also, for whatever reason, like no matter what people think about this power projection game, they tacitly comply to it as a valid social consensus protocol. People acknowledge me as an American citizen or I acknowledge a Swedish person as a Swedish citizen. Why? Because sometime in the last 4,000 years, some war was fought to say that's Sweden, that's Russia, that's China. That's what that country is called. It's the same for all resources. It's the same for all contracts. All contracts are derived from laws. All laws are derived from a war that was fought to legitimize that law. And that's why we have militaries. That's why we nominate people to engage in the power projection competition. There's ways to get people to cooperate. Civilization can cooperate at massive scale. You can give them a carrot and you can say, hey, if you cooperate with me, you'll benefit. But you also can give them a stick and you can say, hey, if you don't cooperate with me, this will be expensive for you. If you just use the carrot, then you invite a third party to come in and take your carrot, right? Like, you know, if you don't have a navy, you're going to have a pirate problem. If you don't have a if you don't have a standing military, you're going to have a Genghis Khan problem. You're going to have a Roman Empire problem. You're going to have a British Empire problem. You're going to have a Western colonialist arriving on the East Coast of Northern America problem. That's why you have militaries. They make it too expensive to change the state and chain of custody of whatever you claim you own. By the way, you only own anything insofar as you can defend your ownership of the thing. There's no distinction between nature and physics on who owns what. The only way you really own anything is if you can defend anyone from taking that thing from you. And then, for whatever reason, civilization has decided that it's okay. One of the benefits of this power projection game is that if anyone in charge or anyone who's writing the ledger of ownership decides to be oppressive with that power, decides to impose a 25% tax on your tea, then people agree that it's fair play, fair game to enter into a kinetic power projection protocol and into a power projection competition to countervail the control authority of the oppressor. So when King George was kind of overstepping his bounds on our property rights, we started to play that kinetic power projection game with them. We won the kinetic power projection game. Now we say what we own. Now we say what America is. Now we say what the rule of law is. Now we say what contract law is for us. And so, you know, this is something that I understood before learning about Bitcoin. I also understood that, I'm the engineer. I understand how technology plays a pretty significant role in this power projection game. When new technologies emerge, you don't really have an option to opt out. Like, it's not really a negotiation. So, when humans started using spears, like if you want to engage in the power projection game and succeed, you need to also have spears. Like the Schelling point is all the humans have spears. When they've got bow and arrows, the Schelling point is bow and arrows. When some guy named Orban figures out how to make iron cast cylinders and fill one in with gunpowder and put a stone in it and shoot stuff instead of making a trebuchet or a catapult or a ballista, the Schelling point is everyone needs cannons. When warships are created, the Schelling point is everyone needs warships if they want to play this power projection game and succeed and defend what they claim to own. When machine guns are invented, the Schelling point is everyone needs machine guns to play this power projection game, to defend themselves, to countervail the control authority of oppressors if they merge, to achieve consensus on the legitimate state and chain of custody of property. When airplanes are invented, the Schelling point is everybody's got to use airplanes. When battleships are invented, Schelling point is battleships. When intercontinental ballistic missiles are invented, the Schelling point is if you want to defend your country, you better have some intercontinental ballistic missiles. You better have some submarines. When nukes are invented, the Schelling point is everyone who wants to defend their state and chain of custody is you got to have nukes. When, drones are invented and clusters of drones start fighting each other, that's the Schelling point. What do you call a bunch of clusters of drones fighting each other? You call it battle bots. What do you call battle bots in orbit? You call it Space Force. What do you call battle bots? A cluster of drones that instead of engaging in a kinetic power projection competition, they engage in an electric power projection competition. That goes by a different name. It's called Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, all of a sudden we're transforming the kinetic power projection to electric, and that's going to be so important in the future as I think the warfare is going to be more digital as opposed to physical, right?
The best thing about warfare is that if an oppressor emerges, citizens can take arms, they can engage in kinetic power projection, they can countervail the control authority of the thing that's oppressing them. That's how you achieve what is called a permissionless control structure over your property. If you do not have the freedom and ability to take arms, to engage in a kinetic power projection competition, to countervail the person who's controlling the state and chain of custody of property, you by definition are not in a permissionless control structure. You have to rely on whoever's writing the ledger. So we play that game. Humans have mastered this game. We're so good at this game that we forget how good we are. Like, I'll ask you a question. Where do cows come from?
Cows?
Yeah. Like, what are cows? Like, how did we get to cows?
In terms of evolution, I don't know. I don't know what came before cows. There's probably something that looked like a cow that evolved into a cow, right?
Exactly. Where did dogs come from?
The same. Something evolved into a dog.
So yeah, perfect. Humans got sick of having to chase around these giant, mean-looking ox things called oryx and got smart about 10,000 years ago. And instead of hunting them down, they captured them, put them in like a, cage, and they bred them. They killed the mean ones, bred the passive ones, killed the mean ones, bred the passive ones. Did this for 10,000 years until you don't have any mean ones left.
Mm-hmm.
You've
got the golden retrievers.
Yeah. Humans are such effective predators that we genetically enslaved oryx into cows to become what are effectively passive meat bags that we then kill and serve to people on steaks. Most people who eat that delicious steak don't even think of where that steak came from. Most of them haven't even killed anything.
Right.
Like we forget how like metal humans are, like how brutal, how high up the food chain we are. Why? We literally killed everything near us on the food chains. Like all other Homo sapiens humanoid species, all other fire-starting species that hunted them to extinction 30K years ago. Then we take wolves, we do the same thing, genetically enslave them into not predators, but passive things to, just hang out with. Like I tell people, if you ever visited an alien planet and you wanted to know who the apex predator was, look for the thing that keeps other things as pets. And like, we forget this, like we forget that our ancestors would wake up every morning and be like, how do I not die to a pack of wolves today? But I wake up in the morning and I pull up Pinterest and I look at cute, adorable pictures of wiener dogs and add them to my Pinterest page, right?
So, you do?
Oh yeah. So I say all this because like, it's important not to forget these things. It's important that we are animals, we are predators, we play this power projection game. It's important to preserve people's ability to be good at this in order to prevent civilization from falling under oppression. With this all in your background, we get to the point where like, we get so good at this game that we've scaled it to the point where we can't use it anymore. We have scaled the kinetic power projection game to the point where it risks extinction of our species. If we ever needed to be in a nuclear scale war, that would be a war without winners. Right? We risk nuclear annihilation. We can't actually use this game anymore. So we have to develop proxy wars. We have to figure out some other way to engage in a power projection competition that doesn't make our species extinct. And you can do it two ways. You can continue to play the kinetic power projection game, which is effectively going to be clusters of drones fighting each other in like the skies above us. First of all, it'll be human out of the loop probably for the most part at a strategic level. Like it'll be missiles fighting drones or drones with missiles fighting other drones with missiles, right? That's the end state of if we continue this kinetic power projection game. That scales up to nukes. There's no way, like if we were engaging in this cluster of, drone cluster fight and we lost the drone cluster fight, okay, we'll use our nukes to defend ourselves. Like we're basically in a stalemate. Humans are predators. Humans are really good at this kinetic power projection game. We've established this consensus protocol. It's worked for 200,000 years, at least for humans. It's worked for 4 billion years for animals themselves. But it's stalemated. We can't use it anymore. It's too powerful. Kinetic power projection through nuclear weapons is too dangerous. That's bad, right? Now, we don't have the ability to countervail the control authority if an oppressor emerges. If King George starts taxing us 25%, how do you countervail their control authority? You don't. You can't, right? If China starts doing oppressive things to their citizens, how do you stop them? It's hard, right? It's become very expensive. So what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the same game. It's the same power projection protocol we've been using for thousands of years and that animals have been using for billions of years. But all it does is, if you're going to have a proxy war and you're going to have clusters of drones fighting overhead with the humans out of the loop, why do you do it kinetically? Why do you do it in the sky above you? Why don't you just put those drones on a rack and make the power projection game an electric power projection game? Humans are still out of the loop. Humans are still watching drones fight each other. The result of that fight is no one has to bleed. The result of that fight is infrastructure isn't destroyed. The result of that fight is energy becomes cheaper and more abundant for everyone. The result of that fight is we still get to achieve consensus on the legitimate state and chain of custody of the underlying property that's being fought over. The result of that fight is if an oppressor emerges, we still have the ability to countervail the control authority. You know, the results are better in like every possible way. So like, you know, this is what I'm thinking when I'm reading about Bitcoin. I'm thinking this is the future of warfare. This is a promising future of warfare where service members don't have to fight over monetary property anymore, at least not kinetically.
So can you be a little bit more specific? Because I find this so interesting, the idea of Bitcoin as its own military system. We saw China basically say, all right, we're nixing the mining. I think they made the stupidest decision, honestly, by allowing the West to sort of take control and set a precedent for the rest of the world. I mean, how would Bitcoin fight a war? Let's say, you know, China, which by the way, is obviously, as you know, developing these very sophisticated missiles. And I think that they're trying to become more and more insular as an economy. I mean, if they were to emerge as a real threat, a real military threat in the next couple of years, how would Bitcoin fight that?
I think a useful way to think about it is there's different types of property. There's physical property, now there's digital property. Physical property includes stuff like land, water, oxygen, space itself. And, you know, to preserve a permissionless control structure over physical property, you have to have some type of systemic control structure with some type of consensus protocol. That is what warfare is. Warfare is a control structure over physical property. It's good for all the reasons I said before, namely the permissionless piece. We don't have to ask permission for China, from Russia, from North Korea, from Iran. We have the kinetic power projection capabilities to make sure we don't have to ask them for permission. So that's cool. In digital space, but before I go there, I would consider contracts to include fiat, a physical property, because the control structure over it is still physical power projection, kinetic power projection, I should say. Okay. Now we figured out a way to create a digital property. It's pretty cool. You solve the Byzantine general's problem. You partition its state and chain of custody off across the distributed ledger. That's pretty sweet, but you still need some type of permissionless control structure over it. You need the ability to achieve consensus on its legitimate state and chain of custody. You need the ability to countervail the people who write the ledger if they start to become the bad guy. You need the ability to defend the underlying property against some type of denial of service attack. So in the physical property world, we use physical kinetic warfare to establish a permissionless control structure over physical property. In the digital property world, if you want to have a permissionless control structure over your digital property, it's Bitcoin. So Bitcoin literally is the digital transformation of warfare itself, from a kinetic power projection protocol to a electric power projection protocol. If you don't have power projection, you don't have a way for users to take arms to countervail the power of the people who write the ledger. That's the fundamental problem with proof of stake. In proof of stake, the people who write the ledger are the people who have the most money, are the people who get the most compounding rewards over time to keep the most money. So there is no way to, if like the people who write the ledger decide to abuse that power, decide to withhold valid transactions from the ledger because they don't like somebody, or decide to change the rules, then you can't stop them. you are not in a permissionless control structure, you tacitly require the permission of the Ethereum Foundation not to denial of service attack you. And you effectively pay them rent you effectively let them debase your savings to have the privilege of them not denial of service attacking you. That's a permissionless based control structure. That's not how the military works. The military is, I will earn my custody, my ownership of the underlying property through power projection. And so if we enter a world now where we've got two forms of permissionless control structure, one that's kinetically derived, one that's electrically derived, one that protects physical property, one that protects digital property called Bitcoin. I think the future would be some combination of both power projection games. I don't think Bitcoin just like magically solves warfare, but it definitely solves fighting wars over money. And guess what? If property wasn't monetized, like if physical property wasn't monetized, how much do you think we would fight over it? Probably not. The return on investment would probably be pretty low, you don't need a huge standing military. You don't need some super expensive world war. And so the future is some combination of people like me still engaging in the kinetic power projection game, but also people like me taking arms, building the drone, the cluster of drone fighters on those racks, i.e. the mining network. It's a double defense. It would be also, which I think would be cool to think about, it would be your military protecting your miners, your military protecting your, the energy sources that power the miners. It would be some combination of that. And another thing too, which is interesting, is like the strategic security shelling point for monetary property would become completely different. Right now, the shelling point is everyone's got to have nukes. Everyone's got to hold a knife to each other's throats to mutually assure the destruction of the opponent, right? Like North Korea could try to launch a nuclear ICBM at the United States. We'll make sure that's a very expensive decision for them to do that, ditto for any other country. In Bitcoin, if you want to increase the hash, if you want to try to, take over, it's going to be very expensive for you to do that. People can just produce more hash that's super cheap. If another country who is your opponent decides to go to a Bitcoin standard, then you get into a really interesting dynamic, because both of your sides of the hash war are actually mutually beneficial to the other in terms of security. If neither of you are trying to gain 51% control over the network, then the more that Russia builds up their hash defense system, the more we benefit from increased hash overall, because it's now become more expensive for some third party to try to 51% attack the network. So that's why I call the research that I'm doing now at MIT this new thing called mutually assured preservation, is because so long as no one achieves a 51% stake in the hash rate, then like the end state of a hash war is awesome for all those reasons that I said before. Energy is cheaper, more infrastructure, more security, way less incentive to fight over property that isn't monetized. I don't know exactly like the tactical level, what that would look like, but what I'm trying to do is just get people to understand that like Bitcoin's the future of warfare, that Bitcoin is the future of national defense. If the hypothesis is correct, then Bitcoin is more resilient to nuclear, like Bitcoin can survive nation state attack, as we've seen this year from China. Yep. But like, if Bitcoin can survive nation scale power projection, both kinetically and legally, if it can't be stopped, then the shelling point is what the shelling point is when machine guns were invented, or when airplanes were invented, or when any other military technology emerged. The shelling point is, holy crap, get your hands on some Bitcoin as soon as possible, especially before your adversaries get their hands on it.
So basically, are you saying that in order for the US to remain this military superpower that it is, it has to acquire Bitcoin? Because I want to hear a little bit more about your research. One of the things I found really interesting is you talked about this concept of Bitcoin creating frenemies, right? Because it is decentralized. The US is not going to control Bitcoin. It can certainly buy up more than El Salvador has, but no one controls Bitcoin. So you have this, what you talked about, this sort of mutual system where we all protect the network, but that means you're also protecting your adversaries and your enemies, right? So how does that all play into your research?
I mean, there's people behind Bitcoin, right? There's people running the miners. I've got a node downstairs. I run the node. Okay. There's a constitution in Bitcoin. It's written in C++. There's people who agree that this rule of law written into C++ is like legitimate, and we volunteer to run that software, open source software. We volunteer to assign some monetary premium to that software. It's got no other use really beyond that, at least not Bitcoin, nothing that compares. And so it's still like people. The difference is it's not nation states, but like nation states are still made of people. Right? Companies are still made of people. Most of the hash is generated by Americans. C++ was invented by an American. SHA-256 was invented by an American. TCP/IP was invented by Americans. The difference is we hand the baton of the ledger writing power to each other at random to protect ourselves from an intermediary stepping in and abusing their ledger writing power. And it works really well. It works so good that the current intermediaries who are the most threatened by this technology can't stop it, as has been demonstrably proven with China. I mean, Bitcoin's essentially a badass defense system that's stopping some of the world's most powerful country, or that's preventing like denial of service attacks from some of the world's most powerful countries. It's in everyone's best interest to protect their monetary property. You will probably protect your monetary property against confiscation or debasement more by storing it in Bitcoin than you would elsewhere. A lot of Americans are going to use it. Like something that I think, because I get this a lot, like yesterday I was called a traitor for supporting because right now the intermediary is the United States. So if you support Bitcoin, which is still, pretty dang American, it's not okay, I'll just be blunt. I'm trying to like dance around the thing.
Don't dance around it.
Okay.
Be blunt.
It's not a negotiation.
Right.
Bitcoin is not a negotiation. If I can project the most power, I don't need your permission.
Right.
If a bunch of people will project power on my behalf, I don't need your permission. That's what El Salvador is demonstrating to IMF right now. I don't need your permission. I can project more power than you. This is a 4 billion-year-old game. This is how all living creatures establish consensus on the legitimate state and chain of custody of property. So people will be like, well, how could you support Bitcoin? My response is, it's not a negotiation, period. So you can participate in it. It's volunteer code. You can volunteer to assign monetary value to it or not. That's your call. Choose wisely. Consider what the future will look like. It will probably involve a lot of Bitcoin in the world. It will probably involve a lot of people using Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a supply capped commodity. If you buy it now, you benefit disproportionately more from the productivity of other people who use Bitcoin in the future. This is a national, so I might be wrong. Maybe it is possible to stop Bitcoin. Maybe it's not, maybe it is a negotiation. Okay, true. If I'm not wrong, what if Russia figures this out first? What if China figures this out first? Yeah, they made a stupid mistake, but like they also burnt their merchant fleet. But they have a pretty badass navy now. Like they figured out they made the mistake. They figured out they need a navy. So they eventually built it back. What if China figures out, holy crap, Bitcoin is military proof technology. If I use it to defend my monetary property is as close to invincible as anything that's ever existed. That's bad, right? Like, because eventually we're going to have to use it. And now they have way more Bitcoin than we do. And we just forfeited the next 300 years or more. The only way to get our Bitcoin back is through productivity or whatever. So like my position is, if I'm wrong, like let's say we get the United States to add Bitcoin to their treasury. If I'm wrong, the United States printed some money to buy a piece of technology that they didn't need. Okay. It maintains its military dominance. It maintains its USD hegemony. It maintains everything it needs. If the people who criticize me are wrong, we just burnt our merchant fleet. We just forfeited the future to the next person who's going to figure out what they own. People are figuring it out. There are countries now using Bitcoin as, keeping it on their treasury. If I'm right, Bitcoin is the most path dependent, like the most brutally path dependent, no second chances technology ever created. I turned down Bitcoin at $300. That is a painful thing to have to reconcile. Luckily, I got it back. I'm like good now, but there's no going back. The United States needs to understand this, in my opinion. They need to understand the national strategic security implications they make by forfeiting the future of warfare. When Orban the engineer invented cannons and turned up to the Holy Roman Empire and offered to build cannons to Emperor Constantine turned Orban down. A year later, Emperor Constantine is dead. Orban is shooting his cannons at the walls of Constantinople, helping the Ottomans just end the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, at the time, the empire was basically poor, but it wasn't an option. Like when Orban, it wasn't a negotiation. When Orban offered to build cannons for Emperor Constantine, he said, I don't have the resources to do it. Find them, right? Find them or you lose your empire. Now, for that into the future, Satoshi Nakamoto, the next Orban, turns up to the world, says, I figured out the new badass defense technology. I'm willing to build it for you, the United States. If you turn Orban down and you're the richest country, what people will think about that 600 years from now, like we do when we look back at the end of the Holy Roman Empire. They're going to probably think it was a pretty stupid decision. So, for the sake of the possible, like if it is true that Bitcoin is the digital transformation of warfare, what could be more important than buying Bitcoin?